America's most significant nuclear crisis. And joining us later on this morning, our country's leading public advocate, who has been called one of the 100 most influential figures in American history. Together, these men are perhaps the most experienced, authoritative voices imaginable on one of the most important topics any of us confronts at present, the Fukushima disaster and its implications for New York. These men understand the poorly lit corners where engineering, and science, and plant operations, regulatory activity, and disaster relief come together, or don't come together, as the case may be. Those who are former public officials have had access to the briefings that those of us in the audience will never see. They've talked with the experts in the context of these severe disasters, and they are going to bring us information that we would otherwise never have an opportunity to hear. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us all this morning. And those of you who are listening and watching online, or those of you who have access to cell phones, which I'm sure you've turned the sound off on by now, or will after I say this, please let your friends and your colleagues know of the opportunity to see this presentation on live stream. I'm sure we'll manage to get it up after the fact, but there is nothing so immediate and so vital as seeing speeches like this in real time. So those of you who are here this morning, you are a lucky group. Those of you who are watching online, please bring others in as well. Now, at this point, I think that it is my great pleasure to introduce our very first speaker, former Prime Minister of Japan, Naoto Kan. In 2011, Mr. Kan was Japan's Prime Minister during the Fukushima nuclear disaster. At one point, facing a situation where there was a chance that people might not be able to live in the capital zone, including Tokyo, and would have to evacuate. Mr. Kan declared the need for Japan to end its reliance on atomic power and promote renewable sources of energy, such as solar, that have long taken a back seat in the resource-poor country of Japan's energy mix. Mr. Kan resigned as Prime Minister in August 2011 and now serves the Democratic Party of Japan to garner support for alternative energy policies. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Naoto Kan.
まず講演を始める前に、アメリカの皆さん、ニューヨークの皆さんに、お礼を申し上げなければなりません。言うまでもなく、2011年に起きた、東日本大震災、それに伴って起きた福島原発事故に際して、多くのアメリカの皆さんから大変心温かいサポートをいただいたことを当時の総理として改めてお礼を申し上げます。
Excuse us. So, in the aftermath of the great earthquake in Japan in the year 2011 and the subsequent nuclear disaster, we have received a lot of support from people around the world.
また今日はこのニューヨークにおいて、インディアンポイントの原発を心配される皆さんがこういう会を催されるということで、私に招待をいただいたことを大変光栄に思っております。
I feel quite honored to be here by the invitation of people who are trying to work on the issues of Indian Point nuclear power plant.
せっかくの機会ですので、福島原発事故、特にその事故が起きて最初の5日間について少し詳しく皆さんに当時のことをお伝えしたいと思います。
I'd like to take this opportunity to talk a little more in depth about the first 2 days of the accident.
2011年3月11日の午後2時46分に、大震災が発生いたしました。
The great earthquake occurred at 2:46 p.m. of March 11th, 2011.
最初に福島原発について、私に届いた情報は、無事にすべての原発が停止をした、スクラムによって停止をしたという知らせでした。その時はほっとしたことを覚えております。
The first report that I received after the earthquake was that all the reactors in Japan, all the reactors safely shut down, and that greatly relieved me.
しかしそれから1時間ほどの後に、まずすべての電源が喪失をした。さらにはすべての冷却機能が失われた。この報告が来たときに、私は冷却ができなくなればメルトダウンを起こすということを知識として持っておりましたので、本当に大変な事故になったと、背筋が寒くなる思いをいたしました。
But shortly after the initial report, I received another one that said that I'm assuming he's talking about Fukushima Daiichi site. They have reactors lost the external power, and also as a consequence, they have lost the cooling capacity. And Prime Minister, had some knowledge about the nuclear technology, and he realized that this could lead to serious catastrophe, and a chill ran in his spine.
その中で当時は原発についてまだ、圧力容器の中に水がある、第1号機もまだ水があるという報告がその日の夜まで、来ておりました。
Even the night of the 11th, the report was that they still had some water left in the pressure vessel, including the reactor number 1.
しかし現在の検証によりますと、わずか地震が起きてから5時間後の午後8時には1号機でメルトダウンが起き、そして引き続いて圧力容器のこの20センチにも及ぶ厚い鉄の容器を溶かしてメルトスルーが起き、溶けた燃料が格納容器の底に落ちた。これが現在分かっている事実であります。
But today we know that just 5 hours after the earthquake, like 8 p.m. of that evening, at the number 1 reactor, there was the water had evaporated, and there was a melt through, breaking through the 2-centimeter thickness of the wall of pressure vessel, and that the molten fuel was basically going on the bottom of the vessel.
格納容器の底に落ちた溶けた燃料は、
Containment vessel, sorry.
その格納容器の底のコンクリートを熱で、壊していって、そのまま進むと格納容器それ自体から大変高い、放射能を含む物質が格納容器の外に出るギリギリの状態まで来ました。
And the molten, melted fuel, basically on the bottom of the containment vessel, was heating the concrete underneath. And it was on the verge of just the breaking through, and the radioactivity was about to go outside.
もしそうした状況になっていれば、もうほとんどの人間が、1号機ばかりでなく、福島第一原発に近寄ることすらできなくなっていたと思われます。
Had that occurred, thank God it didn't, but nobody could go near, not including the reactor, not just the number 1 reactor, but near the Fukushima nuclear power plant site today.
そうなる直前に、第1号機に水を入れることが可能になり、それによって、格納容器の底を削ることを止めることができました。
But fortunately, we were able to pour water into the number 1 reactor, and we were able to stop the development of further melting the bottom.
しかし翌日の12日午後には1号機が水素爆発を起こしました。
However, the next day, on the 12th in the afternoon, the reactor number 1 had the hydrogen explosion.
そして1日置いた3月14日には、3号機が水素爆発を起こしました。
And then on the 14th, March 14th, the reactor number 3 had hydrogen explosion also.
そしてその翌日15日、私が朝早く東電の本店に乗り込んだその日の午前6時には2号機が格納容器が壊れ、またほぼ同時に4号機で水素爆発が起きました。
On the morning of the 15th, early in the morning, like 6 a.m., when he actually went to the headquarters of Tokyo Electric Power Company, what was happening at the Fukushima Daiichi site was that the reactor number 2, the containment vessel, 格納容器が壊れた、爆発ですか、壊れた。2号機は格納容器が壊れた。broke, and then reactor number 4 also had the hydrogen explosion. At the same, those two events occurred at the same time.
このようにわずか4日間の間に3つの原子炉がメルトスローを起こし、また4つの原発が水素爆発を起こすというこういう事故はもちろん世界で初めてであります。
So within 4 days, 3 of the 4 reactors had either melt down or melt through, and 4 of them had hydrogen explosions. And there was no such severe accident, before, historically speaking.
私はこの事故が起きて1週間の間、夜も総理の執務室に防災服を着てとどまっておりました。
During those days, I just stayed at my office overnight and every night, and wearing those, the emergency response sort of a garb, and I just stayed there.
私が考えていたのはただ一つ、この事故がどこまで拡大するのか、そして、どうやればその拡大を止めることができるのか、さらに拡大したときにどこまでの人が逃げなければならないのか、そのことを常に考えておりました。
What was going through my mind at the time? How far is this going? How worse is this going to get? And how can we stop this from getting worse? And how far do we have to evacuate people? How far are people going to be affected?
そしてその時に頭にあったのは、チェルノブイリの事故に関する報告を私が以前読んだことがある、そのことであります。
And also, I was mindful of the report of Chernobyl accident that I had read.
チェルノブイリの事故は大変厳しい事故でありましたが、事故を起こした原発は1基であります。
It was a severe accident at Chernobyl. However, they only had one reactor.
しかし福島の場合は第1サイトに6基の原発、そして12キロ先の第2サイトにさらに4基の原発、合わせて10基の原発が存在しました。
However, at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, they had 6 reactors. And at the Fukushima Daini, which is 12 kilometers away, they had 4. So altogether, 10 reactors were closely situated.
また、第1、第2サイトを合わせて使用済み燃料プールが11存在しました。
Also, spent fuel pools, including Daiichi and Daini, there are altogether 11 of them.
もしこの10の原発と11の使用済み燃料プールがコントロール不能になったときには、チェルノブイリの何倍何十倍、場合によっては何百倍もの量の放射性物質が放出されると、そのように考えました。
I realized that if all those 10 reactors with 11 spent fuel pools altogether, if we cannot control them, then we're going to have a radiation leak into the atmosphere, worse, maybe 10 times, even 100 times worse that of a Chernobyl accident.
その時には東京を含む大きな範囲から人々を避難させなければならなくなると、こう考えました。
And I fear that in that foreseeable, there is a possibility that the area, including Tokyo, might be affected. We might have to evacuate so many people.
その後、原子力委員会の近藤委員長に専門家の立場から最悪のケースをシミュレーションしてもらいました。
And I tasked the commissioner of Atomic Energy Commission, Mr. Kondo, to come up with a simulation of the worst case scenario.
数日後に上がってきた彼の報告もほぼ私の考えと同じで、250キロ圏、福島から250キロ圏、これは東京も含みます。この範囲から5000万人の人々が避難しなければならなくなるというのが最悪のケースとして述べられておりました。
And his worst case scenario report that came back a few days later basically confirmed my worst fear, which was having to evacuate it's like up to 250-kilometer radius of the reactors, and that has something like 50 million people.
また事故が起きた翌日にはアメリカ政府あるいはアメリカ大使館は日本にいるアメリカ人に対して福島原発から50マイルの範囲からは避難するようにという勧告を出されました。
翌日というのはいつの翌日ですか？
3月11日の翌日です。
So the next day of the earthquake, the United States government and the embassies, the basic State Department, they told the citizens to evacuate from within 50-mile radius.
お聞きしますと、インディアンポイントの原子力発電所はこのマンハッタンから40マイルのところにあるというふうに聞いておりますので、50マイルの範囲といえばこのマンハッタンを含む約2000万の皆さんが住んでいる 地域がその範囲に入るわけであります。
I understand that the Indian Point nuclear power plant is located 50 miles from New York City, and so that's well within 50 miles radius. And in that, if something happens there, then 20 million people will have to evacuate.
今回の福島原発事故の原因はもちろん地震津波という自然災害にもありますけれども、それに加えてこういう地震や津波を全く想定していないかったために、こういった事故に対する備えが極めて不十分であったことに、もう一つの原因があります。
So the cause of this catastrophe, of course, is the earthquake and the tsunami. But additionally, the fact that we were not prepared, we did not anticipate such a huge natural disaster could happen, and we were not prepared for it. That was also the cause.
例えばアメリカでは 9.11 のテロ事件の後、そうした人為的な攻撃があった場合の原発の安全性をどう維持するかということも検討されておりましたが、我が国では日本にはそういうテロはないものだということで、そうした検討も全くなされておりませんでした。
In the United States, after the 9/11, there was a certain security measure taken to safeguard the nuclear power plants against terrorism. But in Japan, we did not feel that there would be such a terrorism that we have to worry about. So we weren't even prepared for that either.
また先ほど冒頭のビデオでありましたけれども、現在福島第一原発からの汚染水の海洋への流出というものが大変心配をされております。
As it was shown in the video earlier, today the contaminated water leaking into the ocean, that is a big concern.
もともと福島第一原発の地形は海から35メートルの崖の上の高台がもともとの地形です。
The original topography of the Fukushima Daiichi site was that it was like a 35-meter high cliff.
しかし建設の時、東電は高いところに冷却用の水を上げるのは経済的に大変費用がかかるので、海面から10メートルの高さまで土を切って、その海面から10メートルの高さに6つの原発を建設したわけです。
However, Tokyo Electric Power Company did not want to spend the money to pump the water 35-meter high, the cooling water. So what they chose to do was to basically level scrape the cliff up to like 10 meters from the sea level, and then that's where the 6 reactors were constructed.
でこの土を切ることによって、もともと地下水が非常に豊富な地形でしたので、その地下水が原発の下を流れて、海に流れ込んでもともとおりました。
So what that ended up doing was that that place had plenty of groundwater to begin with, but by lowering the ground level, basically the groundwater is running right underneath those reactors.
現在の状況は原発事故によって生まれた汚染した水がその地下水と混ざって、そしてその一部が海に流れて出ているんではないかという、こういう心配が今も続いております。
So our concern today is that the radioactive particles from those broken reactors are now mixed in with the groundwater, and some of that is leaching into the ocean.
私自身、3.11 の福島原発事故が起きるまでは、原発については安全性をしっかり確認した上でそれを活用する、そのことを私自身もそうすべきだと考え、そういう立場で臨んでおりました。
My position before March 11th, 2011 was that as long as we make sure that the safety, it's safely operated, nuclear power plant can be operated and should be operated.
しかし 3.11 の事故を経験してから私は考え方を180度変えました。
However, after experiencing the disaster of March 11th, I changed my thinking 180 degrees completely.
飛行機事故や他の事故で、何百人という人が一度に亡くなることはあります。しかし、5000万人もの人が逃げ出さなければならなくなるといったような事故は戦争以外ではこの原発事故を除いてはありません。
We do have accidents such as say airplane crash and so on, and sometimes hundreds of people die in an accident, but there is no other accident or disaster that would affect 50 million people, maybe a war, but there's no other accident can cause such a tragedy.
また原発がなければすぐにも多くの人が飢え死にするといったような事態になるのであればある期間原発を続けるとは仕方ありませんけれども、決してそうではない。原発を使わなくてもエネルギー電気は十分に供給できるということを現在の日本は実証しております。
If we had a situation where by stopping, by not utilizing nuclear power plants at all, if that happens, then maybe just so many people would starve to death or something like. If we had a situation like that, that's one thing. But what we have seen in Japan today is that, even without nuclear power plants, we can actually supply energy to meet our demands.
私が総理の時の最後の仕事は、再生可能な自然エネルギーによる発電を増やすためにフィードインタリフ固定価格買取制度を導入することでした。
The last thing I did as a prime minister before I left the office was to establish the feed-in tariff system in order to encourage the more renewable energy production generation.
その結果、その制度導入から1年間の間に原発にして3基分の電力を太陽光発電で供給することになりました。
What happened was that in 1 year after the feed-in tariff was installed, Japan increased the capacity of solar power generation equivalent of 3 nuclear reactors.
また福島原発になった福島県の海の沖に、巨大な浮いた風力発電の実験が始まっております。
People are also experimenting with the wind power floating wind power generator off the coast of Fukushima today.
この実験が成功すれば、1機について7メガ7000キロワットの風力発電を140機、福島のいわき市沖に並べることになっております。
If this experiment is successful, then we might see, per one generator, unit, you can create 7,000 kilowatt of electricity, and we could have 140 of them.
すでにドイツでは2022年に原発を廃止することを決めると同時に、2050年までには石油や天然ガスを含む化石燃料の使用もやめて、すべてのエネルギーを再生可能な自然エネルギーで供給するという目標を掲げて、すでにドイツは進んでおります。
Germany has set a goal of eliminating all nuclear power by 2022, and also by 2050, they're trying to not rely on any fossil fuel for power. And so all the power will be supplied by renewable energy. That is their goal today.
地球温暖化は海面上昇だけではなくて、ハリケーン、台風、あるいは竜巻といったそういう災害をより巨大化するという報告がすでに IPCC、いわゆる気候変動政府間パネルからも発表されております。
IPCC。
はい。
I'm not sure about the acronym, but IPCC, as an international, I guess, a global organization, has reported that global warming not only affects the sea level, seawater rising, but also it's projecting that it would increase the intensity of hurricanes, typhoons, and tornadoes.
私も世界各地のいろいろな再生可能エネルギーの現場を見てきましたけれども、十分に、この各国が努力をすれば、再生可能な自然エネルギーのみで人間が必要とするエネルギーの供給、電力の供給は可能だと、こう確信しております。
I have visited a lot of examples in the world of renewable energy. And if humanity really work together and develop all the potential for renewable energy, we will not have to rely on any, we can generate all our electricity through renewable energy. I firmly believe that.
Thank you. 最後に、この数ヶ月の私の経験をお話をしてみたいと思います。
In conclusion, I'd like to talk a little bit about in the past several months.
今年6月にはカリフォルニアのサンオノフレ原発廃止の皆さん、今日の皆さんと一緒にシンポジウムを行いまして、サンオノフレ原発の廃炉が決まったことを大変嬉しく思っております。
In June this year, I was in San Onofre and visiting the San Onofre nuclear power plant area and participating in symposium just like this. And it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to receive the news that the San Onofre nuclear power plant is going to shut down permanently.
また今年の9月には台湾の第4原発の反対運動グループに呼ばれました。台北首都からわずか9キロのところに予定されている原発について、特に台湾の女性グループが強い反対の活動を始めております。
In September, I traveled to Taiwan. There's a women's group especially leading the sort of a fight against the creation of the number 4 nuclear power plant or reactor there. And that would be situated only 9 kilometers from its capital of Taipei.
また今年の9月には我が国の伊方原発、四国にある伊方原発の近くで、靖子さんたちにおいでいただいてシンポジウムを行い、 地域の皆さんが伊方原発の廃止に向けて、大変勇気づけられました。
And also in September, with Dr. Yatsuko here, we were at the Ikata nuclear power plant in western part of Japan, and we participated in symposium there, and just met with the people in the community who are trying to shut it down.
そして、最近の我が国の大きなニュースは、今なお人気の高い小泉元首相がフィンランドのオンカラを視察した後、やはり原発をやめるべきだ、このように発言したことであります。
And quite recently, the former Prime Minister Koizumi, I think he was in the office in the early part of 2000s. He's still quite popular today in Japan, and he actually announced that made a statement that he opposes nuclear power now after visiting Onkalo in Finland, which is the permanent nuclear depository.
小泉元首相は現在の安倍首相の、いわばボスにあたる人物でありまして、そういった意味では日本の現在の政府に対しても大きな原発をやめていく圧力になりつつあると見ております。
Interestingly, former Prime Minister Koizumi has a lot of influence over current Prime Minister Abe. So how is this going to play out in the politics in the near future? That's going to be very interesting.
最後に一言だけ付け加えさせていただきたいと思います。
And lastly, I'd like to say this.
原発事故を技術的にゼロにするということは不可能です。
技術的にすいません。
技術的に原発事故をゼロにすることは不可能。
Technically, it is impossible to eliminate nuclear power plant accident.
原発事故をゼロにする方法はただ一つです。
There is only one way to eliminate accident.
それは原発をなくすることだと。それは国民の力によってなくすること。それしかないと。私は信じております。
Which is to get rid of all nuclear power plant. And that has to be done by the will of people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Prime Minister Naoto Kan. Our next speaker is Dr. Gregory Yatsuko. Dr. Yatsuko is former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He was first sworn in as a commissioner of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, on January 21, 2005. On May 13, 2009, President Obama designated him the organization's chairman. During the Fukushima crisis, Chairman Yatsuko recommended that Americans evacuate 50 miles outside Fukushima. On February 9, 2012, Dr. Yatsuko cast the lone dissenting vote on plans to build the first new nuclear power plant in more than 30 years, when the NRC voted 4-1 to allow Atlanta-based Southern Company to build and operate 2 new nuclear power reactors at its existing Vogtle new nuclear power plant in Georgia. Dr. Yatsuko cited safety concerns stemming from Japan's 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, stating, quote, "I cannot support issuing this license as if Fukushima never happened." His pro-safety stance caused much friction with his fellow commissioners, resulting in his departure from the NRC. He has since been appointed to a post on a congressional panel overseeing the National Nuclear Security Administration. Please welcome Dr. Gregory Yachko.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to all of you about my thoughts on the Fukushima accident and what I think is the legacy of nuclear accidents in general in Japan, the United States, and throughout the rest of the world. It's a real pleasure to be here with this group of individuals. I've had the opportunity to sit on panels and attend other meetings with this group, and it's I think a tremendous honor and a privilege for me. I also want to thank Prime Minister Khan for his leadership, not only during the accident in Japan, but after the accident. I think his strong statements and his leadership in moving not just Japan, but I think the world to reconsider all of our energy choices in the future is extremely important, and I want to thank him for his leadership. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the accident in Japan. Mr. Khan, I talked in a very personal way about the details that he was dealing with. I'll talk to you about it from a slightly different perspective and how I saw the accident transpire here in the United States, and in particular how it affected the people who work and deal with nuclear power in this country as well as throughout the world. And I want to focus a little bit about what the impact was here in the United States, the kinds of lessons we learned, the lessons we should have learned, and perhaps the lessons we have not yet actually learned. And then talk a little bit about where things stand, not only in Japan, but here in the United States as well, and what this means as we look to the future. When the accident began, it began with an earthquake followed by a tsunami that struck off the coast of Japan on March 11th, 2011. At the time, I was at home just waking up, and I got a phone call from the NRC Operations Center saying that there had been an earthquake in Japan, and there was a tsunami warning and tsunami alert at that time. The first thought that the NRC focused on, that I focused on, was what kind of impact this tsunami could have on plants on the west coast of the United States. There were forecasts of a potential for a low or small tsunami to reach the west coast. So we monitored the plants and all of the activities related to the tsunami with those plants on the west coast. Thankfully, the impacts were minimal, and there was not ultimately any impact to those plants. At the same time in Japan, there were really two crises unfolding. The first was a tremendous humanitarian challenge with the people who were directly impacted from the earthquake and the tsunami. I was part of discussions focusing on the nuclear issue, but became privy to discussions and activities on the part of the U.S. government to help assist with the humanitarian efforts to deal with the tragedy from the tsunami on the West Coast. In the beginning part, the first day of this incident, there were very few people who anticipated or expected that weeks, months later, we would see one of the most significant nuclear reactor accidents in history. And perhaps more importantly, one of the most significant nuclear accidents involving technology that was closely associated with technology here used in the United States, and ultimately that came from the United States. So it was in the context of this tremendous humanitarian crisis that these issues began to develop. For the next 9 months, a period of time that I think is unprecedented in the studies, analysis, and models that are done about nuclear power plant accidents, the Fukushima reactors continue to be fundamentally in an accident condition. Normally, when a nuclear power plant shuts down or the nuclear reaction turns off, systems turn on to cool the reactor fuel and prevent it from having a significant accident. At the Fukushima Daiichi site, those systems failed. So for the next 9 months, the nuclear fuel would be too hot and would release significant amounts of radiation. As time went on, the radiation decreased as the fuel became cooler. And ultimately, in December of 2011, I had the pleasure and the opportunity to go to Japan and meet with many of the colleagues that I worked with closely in the Japanese government and talk to them about the success in bringing that reactor under control and ending, ultimately, the accident. But at that time, we talked about the fact that this was just the beginning of the cleanup work that would take decades to complete. So when we think about this accident, it's important to keep in mind many of the myths about nuclear power that the accident challenged. And there were many, many significant myths that were challenged. The most probably important was the myth that I think had developed here in the United States, that had developed throughout the world with people in principle who use technology different from Soviet or Russian reactor technology. And there was a myth that had developed that accidents would not happen, in particular severe accidents, would not happen in these reactor types. You would never see an accident progress beyond a minimal release of radiation contained within the nuclear reactor buildings that are designed to do that. And in fact, at the NRC, we would annually conduct exercises to simulate these reactor accidents. And there was always discussions about how complicated and convoluted we had to make these scenarios to actually ever get to an accident or to a simulated release that we could then test the emergency response capabilities. Of course, Mother Nature has a way of confounding all of us and came up with a very simple way at Fukushima. So that first myth of accidents never happening was challenged. And not only was it challenged once, but it was challenged 3 times. 3 reactors ultimately underwent severe accidents at the Fukushima site. A number, again, that was very unusual and unexpected to see a single reactor site have 3 reactors simultaneously undergoing a severe accident. As we look at the accident and what happened, one of the next important myths that was challenged was that any release of radiation would be small and would be contained within the reactor buildings and the containment structures that were designed specifically to do that. Of course, that was not the case at the Fukushima Daiichi site, and one of the reasons was because of the hydrogen explosions that occurred early on in the accident. Again, an area that many had believed had been properly addressed and properly dealt with, so that even if there was an accident that became serious, the impacts of hydrogen would not lead to the kinds of explosions that were seen. Of course, this was an issue, and perhaps Peter Bradford will talk more about it. This was an issue that developed at 3 Mile Island. As the fuel melt began, ultimately there was an accumulation of hydrogen in the containment building at the 3 Mile Island site. So for decades, this has been a known phenomenon. Systems were put in place, procedures were developed, and methodologies were established to ensure that in the event of an accident, a hydrogen explosion would not occur. So again, a myth and a belief that was challenged. Another that was significantly confronted, and again was a legacy of the 3 Mile Island accident, was that we had understood finally how to properly conduct emergency plans and implement emergency plans and conduct emergency evacuations. Clearly, the accident in Fukushima showed that those plans are never as simple to implement as they appear to be, and that unique challenges always occur, which make those even more difficult to implement in reality than we can ever imagine. And finally, as Prime Minister Khan touched on, we shattered the myth that we fully understand all the natural hazards that can impact nuclear power plants, not only in Japan, but of course throughout the world. When we think about this accident then, it's important to keep in mind the personal human toll that the accident has taken. The immediate aftermath, as I said, of the tsunami and the earthquake had a tremendous impact on tens of thousands of people. Lives were lost, people went missing. So you add to that then the stress and anxiety of now having to confront, after all of the water has receded back into the sea, to now confront the difficult challenges over the next several weeks of dealing with the evacuations of over 100,000 people. When I visited Japan in August of 2012, I had an opportunity to visit with some of the families that had been evacuated as a result of the nuclear power plant accident. There's nothing more difficult and challenging than to look in the eyes of a grandfather who no longer sees his children or grandchildren because they have had to move on to another area to find jobs, to relocate their families. I met with an individual, a man who had on the wall the family tree that he had for his children and his grandchildren. These were people that used to live in the same town in which he lived. So to tell these people that they had to be evacuated, that their lives were going to be perhaps permanently disrupted in ways that we can only imagine, is something that I hope no one ever has to go through again. For all of you who live in the New York City area, you can imagine what it's like to have to deal with this by thinking about the Superstorm Sandy that hit New York City recently. During that storm, parts of New York City were left without power for weeks. Now imagine multiplying that and taking those weeks and turning those into years. Imagine having to be outside of your home not for weeks while power was restored, but perhaps permanently. To never see anymore the home where you've marked the growth of your children, the life important lessons and events that have marked your life and those of your family and your friends and all of your community. Imagine having to have that taken from you for a period of time that is undetermined. That is the tragedy and the human toll that the accident in Fukushima has enacted on nearly 100,000 people in Japan. You cannot put those impacts into dollar terms. You cannot put those impacts into terms that are easy to discuss or easy to measure. But they are very real, and it is one of the most difficult aspects of this accident and one of the most important issues that we have to keep in mind. Now, stepping aside from those difficult challenges that we have a hard time measuring, there are real measurable impacts from the accident at Fukushima Daiichi. There is the significant land contamination and the economic impact that has occurred in Japan. 30% of the country's electricity is not available in the usual manner because of the shutdown of all of the nuclear power plants as a result of the accident. And an estimate that was done in 2012 by an independent organization, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, they concluded in their report, and this is a direct quote, that the current rough estimate of the total cost to Japan from the Fukushima Daiichi accident is about $500 billion US. And this is perhaps the most important piece of this statement, which will substantially increase if nuclear electricity generation continues to be replaced for a long time by other means. And of course, that's the situation now that is happening in Japan. So $500 billion is the minimum cost and impact of this accident in Japan. So what does all of this tell us, and what does it ultimately mean? First and foremost, we have to recognize what it's telling us, that severe accidents can and most likely will happen at some point. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in 10 years, maybe not in 30 years, but they will happen. There will be ways that Mother Nature, that human mistakes and errors will lead to these kinds of severe accidents at nuclear power plants. But moreover, what this accident is telling us is that society does not accept the consequences from these severe accidents. Society does not ultimately find it acceptable to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people, to have areas of land be permanently contaminated, to spend close to $500 billion or more to deal with the aftermath of an accident at a facility that is simply designed to generate electricity. So what this accident fundamentally should be telling us is that for nuclear power plants to be considered safe, nuclear power plants should not produce accidents like this. And by should not, I don't mean that they have a low probability or that they have a very little likelihood or that they have a 1 in 10 million year probability. I mean simply that they should not be able to produce accidents like this. That is what the public has said quite clearly after the Fukushima accident, and that is, I think, quite clearly what we need to use as a new safety standard for nuclear power going forward. Now, turning to the United States, I think when we look at the impact of the accident in the United States, there's an unfortunate reality that too many people continue to believe that an accident will not happen here in the United States. And as time goes on and no accidents happen, that belief will continue to increase. But I think it's extremely important that we focus on this issue and focus on trying to address these challenges now to ensure that we don't suffer the kind of accidents that we saw at Fukushima Daiichi here in the United States. You know, I always think about this idea that because an accident hasn't happened means that one won't happen when we think about car insurance. For all of you out there who have cars and have car insurance, I'm sure you'd love to be able to call up your insurer and say, well, you should insure me for free because I've never had an accident in my car. And for those of you who've had accidents, then you can, I'm sure, tell them, well, I've had my accident and I will never have another one again. So you should insure me for free in everything that I do when I drive my car. And of course, the insurance companies will happily tell you that that's ridiculous. Accidents happen, that's why we insure you. So this idea that because an accident's never happened doesn't, here in the United States, of a severe magnitude, does not mean that one won't. So we have to think about all of this in a new way. Now, I talked about one of these tremendous myths about nuclear power, that we fully understand natural hazards. And in the context here of the United States, in this idea that, well, the Fukushima accident was a Japanese accident. It recognized and it pointed to problems in the Japanese system. I simply think that's not true. Around the time of the accident at Fukushima, and while that accident was continuing to transpire, we had our own challenges with natural hazards here in the United States. A plant in Nebraska, the Fort Calhoun station, experienced significant flooding. Flooding, in fact, that it exceeded the planned design limits for the plant itself. But thanks to some intrepid work by an NRC inspector and staff of the NRC, the challenge with this flooding was identified prior to the actual flooding event, and emergency systems and additional measures were put in place to protect the plant. And that was done just about a year before the plant actually experienced incredibly significant flooding that caused that plant to shut down. And a plant that then has had a number of significant safety challenges that have required it to undergo a very significant oversight review and to be shut down for an extended period of time. At the same time, here on the East Coast, we experienced an earthquake that was small compared to the earthquake in Japan, but nonetheless an earthquake that exceeded the design specifications for a plant very near to the earthquake site in Virginia. Thankfully, that plant did not experience any significant impacts, but again, it showed us that our thinking and our understanding of the limits on Mother Nature have been too low and we've underestimated. A plant along the Tennessee River, the Watts Bar facility, also has experienced challenges with flooding. So this idea that we fully understand and we fully know how natural hazards will occur here in the United States at nuclear power plants is simply not true. Unfortunately, as I said, I think in the United States there have not been enough impacts from this accident. There have not been enough learnings from the kinds of things that have gone on. And what I saw from the NRC was at the same time that this accident was transpiring, there was a tremendous push by the nuclear power industry to ensure that the NRC continued to move forward with almost no pause on the activities to license new nuclear facilities, some of the first new licensing activities in decades. And clearly this activity was premature. Clearly we had not yet fully understood all of the lessons and all of the challenges that the Fukushima accident identified. It is unthinkable to me that at that time there was such a pressure to move forward and that there was almost no hesitation on the part of the nuclear industry to say, let's take a pause. Let's understand these lessons. Let's make our plants safer, and let's take a pause and slow down before we do that. As a result, when those plants ultimately came up for licensing, I asked for a very simple condition. I asked my colleagues on the commission that before we allow these plants to be licensed, we put in a requirement that says before they operate, they must implement all of the lessons that we have learned from the Fukushima accident. Unfortunately, I was not supported in that, and I had to oppose the issuance of that license. It's not something that I wanted to do. It's not something that I had ever hoped I would do, but ultimately is what I thought was the right thing to do. Oops. Sorry. Talk about saved by the bell. Sorry about that. And ultimately, we should be thinking about this next generation of plants, if there's going to be a new generation of plants, of meeting this standard to ultimately be able to withstand severe accidents. Why would we not challenge ourselves, a country that prides itself on its ability to advance technology, to advance the limits of safety constantly? Why would we not challenge ourselves to think about nuclear power in a way that doesn't present these kinds of challenges, that doesn't present challenges for severe accidents, that doesn't present challenges for spent fuel disposal? Why is it that we continue to move forward with a technology that has all of these weaknesses and continue to pursue it without stopping? Now, at the NRC during the accident, the NRC came up with a number of recommendations of areas that needed to be improved. And at the time of the accident, I was asked in many scenarios, in many situations, what did I think of the safety of nuclear power plants? Based on the standards and the regulations of the NRC at the time, I said a very simple thing. I said, based on those standards and what we know and what our regulations are today, the majority of plants are operating safely. They're operating within those limits. And I made a very important addition to that. And I said, but if we need and we identify areas and challenges and things that need to be fixed, then we will make sure that we implement those recommendations, that we implement those lessons. And about 3 months after the accident, the staff at the NRC conducted a very, very thorough and authoritative assessment of the weaknesses within our own system. And an analysis that they conducted in about 3 months, which has really stood the test of time. And I think it's a real testament to the people who worked on that and conducted this work. And they essentially came up with 12 high-level recommendations. And there were a number of things in there, like ensuring that we update our regulations for station blackout, that we look at seismic events, we look at flooding events, we look at natural hazards, we look at our emergency response plans. We consider not only the potential for one reactor at a site to have an accident, but the potential for all the reactors at the site to have an accident. They identified issues related to controlling hydrogen, a problem that had thought to have been solved previously. They looked at the need to have better instrumentation on spent fuel pools so that there was not uncertainty, like we saw at the Fukushima Daiichi accident about the condition of the Unit 4 spent fuel pool. So they went through the process of identifying these recommendations and did a tremendously thorough job. But the challenge isn't to identify the lessons. The challenge is ultimately to implement those. And it is unfortunately, I think, in that area where significant weaknesses and shortcomings remain. And I'm going to give you an example of 3 issues. 3 of these very significant, perhaps some of the most significant lessons that were learned from the Fukushima Daiichi accident, and talk to you about where those lessons are today. The first is the seismic reevaluations that are being done for nuclear power plants in this country. The incident at the Fukushima Daiichi site was fundamentally an earthquake which created a tsunami. To this day, it's unclear exactly how much the earthquake or the tsunami contributed. Clearly, we know the tsunami had a tremendous effect, but there may in fact have been impacts from the earthquake itself. So you would think that this is an issue, and especially given the earthquake that we saw in Virginia, This is an issue that would get the utmost attention from a technologically sophisticated industry. But when I was chairman at the NRC, one of the complaints I heard from the industry repeatedly was that there were not enough experts to go back and reassess and reanalyze the seismic impacts on nuclear power plants. Well, my first thinking was, shouldn't we have been doing this all along? Why all of a sudden now do we have to hire all these people to now go out and conduct these assessments and these analyses? Why isn't this something that was being done on a routine and regular basis? Unfortunately, it wasn't. So the latest plan for implementing modifications and taking the best available science about seismic events and how they affect nuclear power plants is to essentially put off this work for another 6 or 7 years. The current schedule, which was recently, this fall, proposed by the industry and ultimately endorsed by the staff of the NRC, was to say that we'll begin a process of making modifications to plants that will be done sometime by December 2016. And those would be for modifications to the facilities that don't require the plants to actually go into an outage. And mind you, these are not modifications based on the best science, the best technical assessment. These are a so-called deterministic assessment, which is basically the kind of approach that's used today. Now, that's just the very first piece, and those are the, I guess you could call those the low-hanging fruit. The real modifications, the changes that could actually impact plant operations, are those things that would require an outage to conduct. The proposal is to have another up to 2 outages to conduct those modifications. 2 outages is generally anywhere between 3 and 4 more years to complete those activities. So we're looking at December 2017 to December 2018 to have those modifications made. Now, the truly sophisticated assessments, the best way to understand how seismic events can affect a nuclear power plant, some of those assessments won't even be done until 2020, let alone the plant modifications that could come out of this. Now, I bring this up because this should have been one of the most highest priority issues that should have been completed from the post-Fukushima lessons learned. And at the time, when I was chairman, I challenged the industry. I said, we should set a goal. We should all be able to agree on a simple goal. Let's implement all of these lessons within 5 years. No industry wants to spend the next 10 years or more dealing with an accident and the ramifications from an accident that happened in 2011. And I challenged the industry to do that. Unfortunately, that challenge will not be met. There's almost no way that on one of the most important issues, the modifications to plants will be made within 5 years for all the facilities. And I think that's just simply unacceptable. Let's take another issue, station blackout, which was known to be the most significant impact from the tsunami and the earthquake at the Fukushima site. When that happened, all the electrical power distribution systems were lost, and the ability to cool the reactors was essentially completely disabled. The NRC is looking to update its regulations and its requirements, again, a process for just updating the regulations that won't be done until sometime in 2016, more than 5 years after the accident at Fukushima. And this was identified as the most crucial issue coming out of the accident, was the ability to better deal with station blackout events and this complete loss of electrical power distribution within the system. Now, just taking one other issue, an issue that throughout the rest of the world, including in Japan, has become an obvious issue and an obvious area that currently operating plants need to address, the so-called filtering of hardened vents. The Commission outright rejected making requirements to filter the vents on nuclear power plants. And essentially what this means is in the event of an accident, when pressure has to be released to reduce the impact from the accident, that the material that's released would be scrubbed of radioactive contamination, a way to further reduce the contamination around the site and to people off-site from the reactor. So unfortunately, what we see is a process in which delay continues to be used instead of actual solutions to problems from an industry that claims it is incredibly technologically advanced, that it is incredibly focused on safety. The time that it will take to try and fully implement these lessons is simply staggering, and I think something that is completely unacceptable. But so let's look at where we are in the United States and in Japan today. At Fukushima Daiichi, there continues to be challenges with cleanup and water management at the site. As Prime Minister Khan talked about, there is an issue with groundwater contamination. So while the immediate accident is over, the challenges from this accident continue. And I think to some extent, the good thing that has come out of some of the recent reports and the recent contamination events has been a renewed focus on this tragedy in Japan. A renewed focus on the need to have sufficient and exhaustive oversight of the utility, TEPCO, that not only created the accident, but ultimately has the responsibility to clean it up. The government has stepped in to provide more resources to ultimately deal with these issues, but make no mistake that they will not be easily solved. For any of you who've ever had a home or lived in an apartment that had water leaks, you know water has a way of finding its way into almost anything. And water will find its way into the reactor site for some time, and as long as there's a significant source of contamination there, that will ultimately lead to continued contamination of the sea and the groundwater around the site. But ultimately, the international credibility of the Japanese nuclear industry is at stake, and with that, the credibility of the Japanese economy as a whole. And as Prime Minister Khan said, there is no other electricity source, no other technology that we have that can create these kinds of economy-wide impacts, that can challenge the economy of an entire nation. If we look to the United States, the challenges are somewhat different. Here in the United States, economics continue to be a major factor in driving the decisions about nuclear power plants, but something very unique has happened over the last several years. We have seen a number of plants that have either announced or have actually closed at a time in which the industry was proclaiming itself to be in the verge of a nuclear renaissance. We're in fact seeing the number of nuclear power plants actually decrease for the first time in a long time. Oyster Creek is planned to shut down in 2019. Kewanee, a plant in Wisconsin, was not able to be bought and shut down. Vermont Yankee announced it will shut down next year. And of course, the ongoing fight with Indian Point will perhaps lead to the same situation. But what's perhaps more concerning is the fact that there have been two plants that have actually shut down permanently ultimately because of safety issues. The two units at St. Onofre experienced a steam generator tube rupture that turned out to be the creation of a number of different factors, but ultimately it was a poor design, and a poor design that led to extremely expensive pieces of equipment being unable to perform their function properly and leading to a small radiation leak. And as a result of that safety challenge and the inability to properly analyze and understand exactly what happened and propose an acceptable solution, those plants were forced to shut down. A plant in Florida at the Crystal River site shut down because they were unable to properly repair damage to the concrete containment building that contains the reactor. Now, when you think about this, this is 3 reactors from a fleet of about 100 reactors. What industry would tolerate the failure of 3% of its assets in such a way and still consider itself to be a viable industry in any sector of the United States economy? These are assets that are worth, if nothing else, billions and billions of dollars that because of safety challenges had to be shut down. If that doesn't tell us something about this technology, I'm not sure what will. So as we look here to the future, in Japan, because of the leadership of Prime Minister Khan, they are beginning to look at alternatives to nuclear. They are dealing with a situation in which their nuclear power plants have been shut down. And they're forced to figure out how they can cope and how they can ultimately manage. And because of his leadership, they will ultimately figure out a way to do that that allows for Japan to meet its goals and meet its desires to address climate change and carbon emissions in a way that is done, hopefully, without nuclear power as well. But there will be, for decades, a cleanup activity at the site at Fukushima. There will be the water management issues. There will be the removal of spent fuel pool. There will be decontamination of communities in the hopes that some people may be able to return to their communities. But after years and years and years, it's hard for a community to be brought back together. There will be the removal of the melted fuel, or perhaps the inability to remove the fuel and the need to simply leave it in place. And then ultimately, some type of decommissioning of these reactors, a process that will take probably my entire life to finally be completed. This is a significant challenge, and one that cannot be forgotten and cannot be lost. In the United States, when we think about the future, I'm reminded of a speech that I gave many years ago in which I talked about the future of nuclear power. And at the time, I proposed that there were two futures. There was a future in which there was a thriving industry because safety truly became the #1 priority for the industry, because they looked at novel and new ways to deal with severe accidents, to reduce not only the possibility, but to completely eliminate the possibility of severe accidents. That the management of spent fuel in the long term had been solved and resolved, and the industry was able to move forward in a thriving way with a new generation of bright young people willing to pursue this technology because it truly was beneficial. The other alternative was a future in which the industry would be declining, where the focus would be more on decommissioning and trying to sustain an industry in which people no longer saw it had a future, and the best and brightest no longer went in to pursue this technology and pursued other alternatives. This is a future in which